I want to tell you a little bit about the Religion and Public Life program housed in the School of Social Sciences Research Institute, which I direct. As a forum for research and engagement involving institutions and individuals, the Religion and Public Life program, as is our goal to encourage productive conversation about religion and public life, not only within the academy, but also between the academy and the general public. That's why I'm just so pleased to see what I think are many community members here today. It's just really exciting, especially since you had to do more than just walk across campus, although this weather, walking across campus was quite a big deal. So thank you to the students who are here as well. And what we're doing through the Religion and Public Life program is training students and providing scholars resources to do research on religion, the most contentious issues facing religion in the public sphere today, but also to go one step further and to really translate that research to the broader public in the ways that bring more intelligent, productive conversation about religion into the public sphere. And that's a really tall order. So I'm especially pleased to be partnering with the Baker Institute today and the Texas Freedom Network in this event. So let's just get right to the topic of this session, which is religion, immigration, and politics in the 2012 election. And the format will be something like this. I have 4 or 5 talking points that I want to share with you. But then after that, we'll leave some generous time. The session will go about 45 minutes. We'll leave some generous time for you all to ask. You like that phrase, you all. I'm actually from the Northeast, but this has sort of creeped into my parlance. We'll leave some generous time for you to answer, ask questions of me and of one another, and us to have a dialogue about these issues, which we can have in this somewhat smaller session than we have in the larger room.
Excuse me.
Yes?
Those of us on this side of the room can't see you.
I know. You know what? I'm just going to walk around, but then I will be away from the mic.
Can you scoot your podium forward?
Yes. You know what? We have the computer, yes, is actually tied to the ground. I wonder if there's a way that we can move it. Do you have any technical experts from the Baker Institute in the room or not?
I think abandoning the microphone might be the most
option. I fear that if we abandon the microphone, it won't be for the video. I do not. So if you can just...
If you don't need
and you can unplug it, that's a great idea.
other way.
That's not the webcam.
That one back and that one forward.
There we go. There we go. Thank you, Sam. So recent estimates from polling, a variety of polls, suggest that nearly 25% of the American population right now are immigrants or the children of immigrants, which we refer to as second-generation immigrants. I first encountered the complicated nexus among religion, politics, and immigration when I started a national study of immigrant religion about 5 years ago. According to Michelle, a young Korean-American woman who's a business leader and considers herself an evangelical Christian that I had the privilege of talking to for about an hour about these topics. And she said at one point, I feel like more Asians should be involved in politics and more Christians as well. In general, I would like to see more minorities just step up into politics. And I think that's why there needs to be Christians and integrity in the government. I think this kind of quote that this young woman put forth is somewhat typical of how immigrants see their religious commitments and the kind of integral role that such commitments have in their lives. But I don't think it's obvious which way they fall often in terms of voting, what kind of impact, deeper impact that those commitments have when they vote and when they take other kinds of political action. So hopefully we can tease out some of that today. Let me give you some more background information that I think will help sort of situate our discussion. First, I want to talk a little bit about what religion provides for politics, taking off some of the excellent comments that our panelists just gave to us. Even though the U.S. lives legally and culturally to some extent under the separation of church and state, religious organizations and individuals are still a vitally important part of shaping public policy, legislation, and social movements in some specific ways that scholars see. Congregations provide people with resources for political movements in very tangible forms. So these might include things like leaders, places to meet, just a big group of people, social networks. I remember talking to a very well-known religious leader in the Houston area after Hurricane Katrina, who said that, you know, going to the Dome to get those beds set up when we welcomed victims from the hurricane was something that religious organizations could do best because they can draw a crowd, right? So some of the churches of the size that we have in the Houston area, if their pastor says we need, 1,000 bodies to do this task and to get it done, then we can get those people out there doing something. So that's a very obvious role that religious organizations have in American society. These forms of capital, as we call them, so these things that have a sort of greater payoff than the entity itself, nurture efficacy for political action. So those who see the connection between religion and politics might say that Dr. Martin Luther King Jr. was a successful civil rights movement leader largely because of the kind of skills he gained in the church through his work as a pastor, skills like including the ability to speak well in front of a crowd. But beyond that, religion provides something deeper. I don't think we should only see religion in that kind of functional way. Religion also provides motivations and meaningful rhetoric for political action. So such moral meanings support political action in a variety of ways. So think of something like religious teachings, the kind of emphasis that they place on care for the poor. Some kind of emphasis that religious teachings might place on bringing an awareness of injustice. When pastors implicitly endorse candidates through whom they pray for and whom they pray against, right? From the pulpits of their sanctuaries, they impart partisan views to their churches, even if they don't have an actual voter registration drive. Churches and pastors also model for their participants whether it's more in keeping with being a good Christian to be a pro-life Republican, a social justice Democrat, or to remain largely uninvolved in political life. Even remaining uninvolved is to take a certain stand about how we see the connection between religion and politics. Such categorizations are important in political life because when individuals don't vote in community elections because pastors categorize voting as unimportant, then people in churches lose their voice in local and national elections. Likewise, when religious individuals form movements around fighting racial injustice on the basis of the belief that God created all people equal, then religion also serves as a source of mobilization. Secondly, I think we need to talk a little bit about, to situate our conversation, a little bit about the connection between religion and immigration. As recently as surveys conducted this past year by the National Immigrant Survey housed at Princeton University, by the Pew Forum surveys, showed that nearly 2/3 of recent immigrants are Christians, with 42% of these Catholic and the rest Protestant. Such results confirm the work of other scholars who argue that new immigrants are actually increasing the racial and ethnic diversity of American Christianity, as well as bringing larger numbers of adherents of religions that are not Judeo-Christian, bringing larger numbers of adherents of Hinduism, for example, of Islam. More than 4 times as many immigrants as native-born Americans report religious affiliations that are part of these faiths. So vastly increasing the religious diversity in American society. Simply put, religion helps immigrants adapt to the U.S. Scholars of immigration argue that religion has very functional benefits for immigrants, things like fostering ethnic identity, retaining language for the second generation. For the first generation, religious organizations can be places where immigrants gain access to job networks, a social community in a new and foreign environment, English language classes even. Some of my own work on religion, immigration, and politics with Michael Emerson, my colleague from the sociology department, has revealed that religion has the power to guide new Americans under certain conditions, even towards participating in American politics when they report they would not have if not for the resources provided in their religious organizations. For example, I asked a second-generation Chinese American, a high school teacher who considers herself a Catholic, what her role in American politics is. And she says, maybe if I were a fifth-generation Korean American, then maybe it would be a lot easier to answer the question. Like my town, of all Chinese people in the first generation, they would never vote for the school budget, so the school budget would never pass. They didn't know much about politics because they were new to the country. The second generation, they're not so ignorant. They're not ignorant of the politics in the new country, and it doesn't anymore inhibit what we can do and how we can help. And we have a responsibility to use our religious affiliations to mobilize to make a political difference. Third, let's talk a little bit about some of the specific opinions that polling research gives us about what immigrants think in sort of a grand scale, knowing that there's diversity certain, what the most influential immigrant groups think. Latinos, many of whom are immigrants or second-generation immigrants, can be described in general terms as more voters because of the large size of their population, and also as more non-voters. Scholars are finding they are not voting to the extent that they could given the large proportion of their population. So, for example, in 2010 midterm election, more than 6.6 million Latinos voted. This represented about 7% of all voters compared to about 6% in 2006, and this is statistically different. While a great increase, it's not nearly representative of the population of Latinos in the U.S., where we have nearly 18% of the U.S. population identifying as Latino. 10% of eligible voters are Latino, yet less than 6% actually vote. A couple of reasons for this. Partly it's because of the youth of this population. So 1/3 of Latinos are younger than 18, which is greater share than any other group in the U.S. So we need to keep studying this very influential group in the U.S. to figure out what will happen in future years and future generations, especially because we're finding that there is a likelihood that even in the second and third generation, Latinos will continue to speak Spanish, which is not as common with other immigrant groups. And this kind of language cohesion can provide a greater force and power for mobilization. So that's an extremely important group. As you probably know, many Latinos are Catholics, and Latinos make up 16% of Catholic voters. So this, as I mentioned briefly in my little teaser, that this group, the Latino Catholic vote, is very important to think about and how that will fall out. Different from some Catholics at large, Latino Catholics tend to identify more with the Democratic Party, 64%, than do Catholics overall at 44%, according to a recent Pew survey. And when we do interviews with Latinos, there is the suggestion that politics and public affairs are deeply influenced for them by their faith, that religion provides for them a kind of moral compass. And they expect religion to provide a kind of moral compass for political leaders. So they're expecting more of their political leaders in the kind of things that they think of as moral issues, which is important to remember. Latinos are also represented, I think this is not often thought about, are also very represented among evangelicals. And those Latino evangelicals are twice as likely as those who are Catholic to actually identify with the Republican Party. So there's a diversity there in the Latino community. A recent political pundit who wrote for The New Yorker said that the GOP candidate has no chance of winning if not courting at least 35% of the Latino vote. So this is a group which came up a lot in the previous election, and I think promises to continue to come up in this election as well. Asian Americans are the other large group in the U.S., not as numerous as Latinos, but still representing, given some estimates, about 6% of the overall U.S. population, and promising to grow in subsequent decades, even to 8 to 10%, depending on which surveys you look at. But they are very overrepresented. Michael Lindsay talked about that a little bit in his talk. He sort of alluded to that. Asian Americans are very overrepresented in some religious groups, especially among Catholics, Filipinos, among evangelicals, Koreans in particular, and Chinese. And especially the first generation brings a more conservative voice to these traditions and denominations, a more conservative theological voice and a more conservative political voice, but also tends to not be as politically active. So really the money is out in terms of what's going to happen with the second generation, who is vastly growing in their political activity and also using religion as a piece of that political activity as a kind of a guiding force. I want to talk to you just briefly about this research that I've been involved in the past 5 years, where we have done a survey that's actually a takeoff from Michael Emerson's Portraits of American Life survey, which had overrepresentatives of certain racial groups, which meant more immigrants in the survey. And then we followed up the immigrants in that population, and we did 250 interviews using 5 different languages with different immigrant groups in the U.S. And I want to give you a little bit of what we found, and we have some articles coming out from this study. We found that for both native-born blacks and whites, that those who attend religious services regularly are more likely to be politically active than those who don't attend religious services. So for native-born people, both blacks and whites, that there is some kind of motivation that religion gives, and we don't know exactly why that is, but some kind of motivation to be more politically active. There's a difference, though, when it comes to immigrants. For those immigrants who are Christians, either Catholics or Protestants, religion also has that kind of inspurning of political activity. However, for those immigrants who are members of U.S. minority religions, those who engage actively are actually involved in fewer political activities. So those who are part of Christian religions tend to have an increased amount of political activity, and those who are part of minority religions, who, in our case, the ones that we surveyed were Hindus, Muslims, Buddhists, and some other minority faiths in the U.S., it actually decreased. But when we got into these communities and did interviews, it told a different kind of story than you can get from a survey, where individuals were actually wanting very much to be politically involved and just didn't have the kind of networks that those who are a part of Christian denominations and traditions have. And I think that's a very important finding from doing this kind of qualitative work, where we go into the communities and talk to them. It's very important to understand that there's the kind of desire there, especially to participate in activities that are beneficial towards immigrant communities. I remember having a talk with a Muslim congregant who was very actively a part of his mosque and was very involved in education reform, local education reform. So he wouldn't show up as someone on a survey who would vote in national elections. He actually said he didn't vote in national elections, but he was actually very politically involved at the local level around issues of trying to get immigrants more education and really wanting, and this is very true, I think, of Muslim immigrants, really because of the kind of discrimination that Muslims face in the U.S., trying extra hard to appear civically involved, to be very involved in their local communities. We found that over and over again when we did interviews with Muslims, really wanting to be sort of super involved, super good Americans in terms of the kind of benefits that their religion would provide to American society. I think because of genuine interest and also because of reaction to the kind of discrimination that they face. In terms of the 2 main issues, just switching forth to talking a little bit about the 2012 elections, the 2 main issues that I see as being, they've already come up even as we listen to the Republican candidates debate for the 2012 elections, are undocumented immigrants, which come from 2 major sources: people crossing the border and from those overstaying their U.S. visas as students or workers of other kind. I think that second source of undocumented people we don't talk about very much, but that's also a main source of undocumented immigrants. We tend to place all our attention on people who cross the border. And also what we do with immigrants, the kinds of benefits that they receive in terms of education and how we think about adaptation in American society, that also has come up already in these debates. And some things that we need to think about is that religion not only guides potentially the political activities of immigrants, but religion can also guide how the general U.S. public perceives issues of immigration. And I think that's an important way to think about it in the other direction, that religion can also guide how the general population perceives immigration, because religious teachings can really guide people in different sorts of ways when it comes to how they think about immigration policy. According to a recent news report out of a local Arizona newspaper, I want to read you a quote from the journalist who said that, tired of waiting for federal immigration reform, Arizona, Georgia, Utah, South Carolina, and Indiana have all passed laws in recent years attempting to remedy the complications caused by undocumented immigrants. But no one has gone quite so far as Alabama, whose law has been branded as radical. Its hardline stance on hiring and renting to undocumented people, demands for schools to identify undocumented students in classrooms, and forbiddance of transporting undocumented in any way, shape, or form have many up in arms. It's also important to notice that in Alabama, close to 85% of the population is Christian. The Bible has come up as a major talking point. It's my interpretation, not what the journalist said. Nearly all of the state's major Christian denominations have officially spoken out against some of these reforms. At least 4 bishops, an Episcopal, a Methodist, and 2 Roman Catholics, sounds like some kind of weird joke, have sued the state, claiming that the statute comprises their right to free exercise of religion and makes it, quote, a crime to follow God's command to be good Samaritans. But within the congregations, undocumented immigration remains a divisive kind of issue. So while leadership may sort of lead us to believe that there's, really fighting these immigration supposed reforms, statistics also suggest that the majority of their followers may use religion to lean the other way. So there's a kind of diversity here that we need to be savvy to. Religious leaders are stuck often in a kind of doctrinal gray area, because when we're talking just specifically about Christian teachings and not even considering other holy books, the Bible itself puts teachings at odds. In Romans 13, Christians are told that they're under a biblical mandate to respect the divinely ordained institution of government and its just laws. But as one Catholic bishop said, the Bible also commands believers to show compassion and justice for the sojourner and alien among us. I think I'll stop there and just sort of help us lead a discussion for the remaining time that we have. So just raise your hands and let's go. Yeah. Could you say your name?
My name is Joyce Roberta Miller Albert, and I'm a teacher, high school teacher.
Welcome.
Thank you. We have an interesting possible case study locally, and I wondered how much time, or if anybody was doing the research. What came to mind is when you're talking about the Asian population, you have Sugar Land. I believe the second largest percent of Asians in any city in the country of that size. It would be interesting to go and look, not just to look at the Asian community, but to break it down, because you have both Pakistani, huge Indian population in Telfair, you have Chinese, and you have a difference in religion as well, both Hindu, Buddhism, Muslim, but also you talked about, you hinted for just a second, you mentioned local politics. And that's really, we've been focused on presidential politics, but when they referred back to 20 years ago, that PBS special, that was about taking over local school boards. Because if you could take over local school boards, you can then influence how people think, because you're influencing young people. So there's so much to look at in terms of local politics, school board elections, now a state legislative race.
Yeah, I think that's just right, Joyce.
And just one other point is that in the last election, and I apologize, I can't remember if it was county or city, you had a candidate who ran, and the anti-Muslim, this is a terrorist, came out, and some of the community just sat there and let it go by. So looking even at this very last election as well would be a great case study.
Yeah, there is some work going on. So one of the, our own work does look at local Houston area immigrant communities. We looked at these 5 different traditions. We looked at Indian Americans, Mexican Americans, also Chinese, Koreans, Filipinos, and native-born African Americans. And just to sort of support what you're saying, Joyce, which I think is a very good point, we almost can't overestimate the importance that religion has in these communities. So, for example, being a good sociologist, some of you probably know some social science methodology. I thought, well, if I'm going to study Latino religion, we should study a religious organization that Latinos are a part of that's not religious, right? So we kind of have this comparison between the religious group and the non-religious group. Well, we really could not find a community organization in Houston that was made up of Latinos where religion didn't matter. So that's, I mean, that's the kind of practical that shows, I mean, that's very telling because at least in this community, it shows just how important these kinds of affiliations are. And I think Joyce's point, sort of sub-point is to be well taken, that the reaction against can also be a very important kind of political motor. A reaction against religions that appear other, different can be an important kind of political force as well. Yes?
My name is Mervyn Osmond, I'm also a teacher. Another interesting local event was the prayer rally that Mr. Perry held.
Yes, absolutely.
And it was interesting to see where the institutional muscle came from. For him, it was national and everything else, but look, there actually was a group, which is ad hoc, who came together to try to offer an alternative. But again, I think it's telling again that the institutions they have are permanent, ongoing. Ours are ad hoc. No, ours, I should say. Those who oppose that kind of thing are ad hoc. Is that a common same thing you see in other cities as well?
That's right. That's right. Although we did find, we did some of this work in Chicago and in New York and in LA for this study that I'm talking about. And there is a kind of, how shall I put it, a kind of public religious culture that's available in Houston. I almost slipped and said the South. I know Texas is its own thing, not to be called the South flippantly. But that, I think that kind of public rhetoric used in a variety of different ways. Did you say your name was Marvin? Mervyn, I'm sorry. It used in a variety of different ways, Mervyn, is very important to remember that it's not just used in one specific way, that it's appropriated differently by different groups, but that there's sort of more religion, to sort of put it in almost a crass way, there's more religion in the air here, right, than there is in some other places, just in obvious demographics. Yes.
Excuse me, I'm Sidney Buchanan. As the citizen Asian American and the citizen Hispanic American goes to the polls this November, how important to them in their ultimate decision of who to vote for will be this very controversial issue of what to do with the host, large number of people who brought in as children, grow up, go to school, and out there, and will that be do you find that will be a swing issue for the citizen Asian American and the citizen Hispanic American?
For Asian Americans, it does not appear to be. Asian Americans have considerable more diversity on this particular issue. But keep in mind that when we think about Asian America, that is 7 different groups that are the largest representatives in the U.S. That represent Asian America. So that's a considerable amount of ethnic diversity. So we shouldn't, just because we label them Asian American, we shouldn't expect them to be as similar as that label would sound, that there's actually considerable diversity politically and religiously. When we say Latino, that is one majority group, and that's Mexican Americans. And Mexican Americans do think of immigration as an extremely important issue, but they do not fall out completely as Democrats, as it would that would lead us to believe that they're just Democrats, through and through, that these things are bundled together with other issues. They're more like Republicans on sort of conservative, what they perceive as moral issues. Immigration, of course, can be a moral issue as well, but what we typically label in American politics as the moral issues like abortion, like same-sex marriage, they are more like Republicans, traditional Republicans on those issues, but more like Democrats. So they really can be, this is a type of swing vote, which is important to keep in mind because of the large numbers of the group. Yeah.
Hi, Matthew Morvick. I was wondering if you could comment a little bit on global south-north migration. It's not something I've heard much of, but Jehu Hansels at Fuller comments about how especially South America and Black African are highly Christian, highly Pentecostal, and it's going to change the face of religion in the West. And I was wondering if how that might affect politics as well, if that's something you've looked at.
Africans are certainly coming to the U.S. in larger numbers, but not in large enough numbers to have a distinctive impact on African American Christianity in the U.S. That they're coming in much larger numbers to Europe than they are to the U.S. And so but yet they tend to also have the same kinds of patterns as Indian Americans tend to be. People they're coming from countries where they are the most educated. So we have an African population that's coming to the U.S. that tends to be more highly educated than some other immigrant groups. And when you get highly educated immigrant groups coming to the U.S., this has an impact on denominational structures. So I think Korean Americans are a very interesting example, and I use them because that's what some of my own research has been on, because they're actually a relatively small proportion of the U.S. population, like the third or the fourth, depending on survey research, in terms of ranking of numbers for Asian American groups who come, yet they're having an enormous impact on the Presbyterian Church in the U.S., right? Because they're so likely to be Presbyterians and Methodists to a lesser extent, and they're bringing a real conservativizing force to those seminary structures, to that institution. Yet, on the other hand, a kind of concern often with a kind of racial consciousness. So in some ways conservative, but in some ways liberal. So this is a sort of interesting dynamic. But you're right to bring up African migration, because that's certainly happening on a global scale, and we need to pay attention to that in Europe in particular. Yeah.
I just found it interesting myself, and to sort of as a comment, that I was surprised when I visited the Asia Museum, which is not yet open up here, that a influential subgroup of that Asian group is Australians. And the problems that you must encounter in your studies is to, when you talk about studying the Asians, who you're talking to.
I said to my students at one point, if we're not really, really interesting, I would never do it again, because it's so practically difficult to do studies of immigrants. I mean, the kind of language, and you just think you have these neat categorizations, and it just totally blows your researcher mind, because they just don't line up the way that you think they do. But it's a wonderful, wonderful work. That's a very important comment. Yes.
Hi, I'm Lisa Waddell.
Lisa,
I just wanted to follow up on his question
Yes.
about kind of the DREAM Act, kind of how, where immigrants are falling on that. Is it important enough to, you indicated it's a swing issue, but where are they falling, and what
Latinos are, yes, that's right. Latinos tend to be very favorable in general. And even, I think it's important to remember, it's not, we find in survey research, even on the third and fourth generation, and we should know this living in Texas, that we have a very rich Latino culture here, which goes back very, very far. So even people whose family tradition has been here much longer than some white groups still think of immigration as an important issue, still want more resources for immigrants, still want lessening restrictions on undocumented people in the U.S. So that's a very pervasive, and survey after survey shows that there's this kind of pervasive. Asian Americans, it's much more, I think it's much, much more split for the kind of diversity of the group. Yeah.
My name's Wendy. I have a question for you about the Voting Act that's coming up, the voter ID. What is your take on that, the disfranchisement of the blacks and the Hispanics? How can they fight it? What's your personal opinion?
Yeah, that's a hard question. I don't know that I have like a real personal opinion about it, but just how it's related to immigration, I think I would answer kind of in much the same way I've been answering about these issues related to immigration. I do think that those kinds of acts will be very, very important. Those kinds of initiatives will be very foundational to the Latino community in particular. Yeah.
You made the statement that Carolyn Hockley made the statement about the Latino is basically the Mexican American, but there are so many scattered across the United States that come from Central and South America, and they actually resent being referred to as Mexican.
Absolutely, absolutely. And so, but there's a kind of demographic reality, but then we want to keep in mind the kind of diversity, right? So these general statistics, I think you raise a very important. I didn't get your name. I'm sorry. Carol, and these kind of when we do large scale demographic kind of trends, this can obscure the kind of intensive diversity. So you raise an excellent point. So you're looking at about an 80-20, right? So about 80% Mexican Americans, but then 20% split up among other Latin American groups. So, and these statistics are changing all the time because the Mexican American migration is really in flux. Yeah. Yeah. Oh, okay. I'm sorry. I need to look to my left, which I should because I'm left-handed. Yeah.
We know that the South and Texas in particular have a long history of exercising prejudice against black voters, even though it was legal to vote. And almost every time you hear the term immigrant or immigration, it's preceded by illegal. or undocumented. What do you think that plays a role in holding down the legitimate vote of immigrants for fear of being treated differently at the polls?
Can you rephrase your question a little bit?
Okay, if I'm a legal immigrant and I go to the polls, how much, if I don't go to the polls, the fact that normally all immigrants are called illegal immigrants by the majority party or the majority people, what does that have?
Sure, I see what you're saying. This kind of culturally, this what we would call, implicit or unspoken discrimination, right? Even if it's not overtly stated, is there this kind of cultural perception that will hold people back? I will say that just in the initial research that we've done on Puerto Ricans, which are a weird case, right? Because in some ways they look like immigrants, but obviously they're not very much so in another, but yet they often perceive themselves very much as immigrants. And so we included them in our study alongside Mexican Americans. There was this sense of never feeling like you fully fit in. I don't know if I would make that next step that you're perhaps implying that keeps them from the polls. I don't know that we can make that kind of link with at least the kind of social science research that I have available. It's plausible, it's something that could be studied, but I don't know that I can make that link right now. Yeah.
My question has to do with voting performance. You said a third are under the age of 18. And what did you say the voting, what was the percentage of voters, did you say?
I think I said about 7%.
Yes, yeah. I thought, was that alarming? And my question is, when you talk about the church being very central to the identities of Latino and Latinas, do you see any movement for the church to emulate the African American community as a way of mobilizing and galvanizing? Because whatever their opinion about the DREAM Act, until they vote, until they register their opinions with votes, they are not going to be seen or taken as seriously, given how we're even going to redistrict Texas congressionally. They're totally being ignored in this latest redistricting plan.
That's right. But there is, I hate to say it, but these things take a very long time and they proceed in stages. So my caution would be to, especially in a presidential election year, we're going to really overemphasize voting. And I think it's right to place some attention there. But there are these local level initiatives, these local level kinds of training. And we studied a Catholic church in Houston that was, teaching people how to fill out voter registration, that was very actively involved in this. And I talked to the parish priest about it, and he said, well, it's not all that effective, but we're just going to keep trying, right? Because first, people don't really know how to speak English, so they're having a hard time, with some of these initial kinds of things. But, so there's lots of steps perhaps that need to come first before this kind of active political participation, but at least to keep bringing this before them. So for that, when we get on the ground and do that kind of work in communities, it does seem that there's something happening there, but it may not be showing up in these kinds of national surveys. But there's a kind of hopefulness that I have from doing that research that it's at least starting. It's probably not going to be quick enough for these kinds of initiatives, which is concerning. That's right. I don't know who to go next. Yeah, you said next, right? So you ask and you shall receive. There's such a desire to use a lot of religious language here. Yes, carry on.
My name's Susan.
Yes.
And I'm interested in sources of information and messages, and particularly when you said for non-Christian faiths that it's a lack of access to networks. Can you say more about that?
There's a growing body of research which argues, coming out of mostly sociology, political science, but some in religious studies, which is arguing that Christian immigrants have an easier time using religion as a basis of civic engagement. And we would include political participation under that, also volunteering and other kinds of community participation. Because there are established sort of Christian ways of doing these things. And they come in, they model themselves after other Protestant and Catholic congregations in the U.S., and they fit right. So when, at the local level, when a soup kitchen wants a set of volunteers, they sort of know which Catholic parishes to go to, and they sort of go, and they may be less inclined. Mosques, for example, may not have those same kind of access to networks. There may be more cultural distance there. And so, but also you have, especially among Muslims, a high degree of education among many recent Muslim immigrants, and education acts as a protective barrier. So people who have education feel like they can reach out, they can make their own networks, they feel empowered. So it sort of still remains to be seen whether education will have that kind of protective barrier that will overcome this sort of difference chasm. Yeah, that's a really good question. Yeah, way in the back there.
My name's Paul.
Yeah, Paul, thank you.
Did you look at the degree to which there is mobility versus stability in residential patterns and multifamily versus single-family housing? And the reason I ask it relates back to a question that was asked earlier about the voter ID law. One of the aspects of it in Texas, if it becomes law, is you have to have not just a picture ID, but it has to be a picture ID for your current address. And people who are in apartment complexes tend to move several times, and they don't necessarily update their driver's licenses. And even if they update their voter registration card, they won't be able to vote. So
that's right.
Do you have some patterns of how the immigrant housing is the same or different from the general population?
That's right. That's right. And there is, especially among first-generation groups, especially among certain immigrant groups, there is a high degree of mobility. Immigrant groups that come to the U.S. with lower income and lower resources are much more likely, this is probably stuff that just seems intuitive to you, but that we're finding in survey research, are more likely to move and move more often than our immigrant groups that come to the U.S. are more likely to come with more resources, that say come on worker visas that require a high degree of education, such as engineers or professional visas. So that is very obvious. The new immigrant survey, which I alluded to, has been following immigrants over years. The Portraits of American Life survey, which is housed in the Kinder Institute for Urban Research in the Sociology Department, is been following immigrants. It's even hard to study immigrants. You can imagine these studies that this affects the study, right? Because it's hard to find the people at the second and third wave of interviews. So these are it's a very practical problem to get good research on this topic, but you're right on. That this is a really big issue for the immigrant community, and for these kinds of voter initiatives will have an implicit bias and perhaps an explicit bias against immigrants of certain types.